The little black girl hid behind the garage wall, calling the biker as threatening voices rose from the street. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. A little black girl, no more than 8 years old, crouched behind the cold concrete wall of a garage, her tiny hands trembling as they gripped the rough surface. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows, praying to stay out of sight. The street ahead was empty, but the sound of voices grew louder with every passing second. Her breath hitched as the voices came closer, and she could feel the fear creeping in like a cold, suffocating fog. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakable, threatening, menacing, with an edge that promised harm. She was used to the shouts, the anger, the harsh words. They were a part of her life, a constant companion in the chaos of her home. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, the voices felt more dangerous, more urgent. She didn't know how long she could stay hidden, how much longer she could avoid being caught. Her eyes darted around, searching for a way out, a safe place to run, but all she saw were dark streets, cold and empty. She thought of her brother, Jamal. Where was he? Had they taken him too? Her heart raced as she realized that she was alone, trapped in this dangerous situation. Her only hope was that someone, anyone, could help her. She had heard stories of the bikers, the ones who rode through the town with their loud engines and intimidating presence. She had seen them before, passing by with their leather jackets and their tough exteriors. She had heard whispers about them, how they were always there for the community when things went wrong, when people needed protection. She wasn't sure if it was a story or truth, but right now, she had nothing else to hold on to. With a trembling hand, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Her fingers were stiff as she unfolded it, revealing a number scribbled in black ink. She didn't know why she had kept it, but something told her it was important. It was a number for one of the bikers, a man who had promised her father, years ago, that he would look after her if anything ever happened. She didn't know much about him, only that he was part of a club called the Thunderwolves. She didn't know how long it would take for him to answer, but she had to try. Her voice cracked as she whispered into the phone. Please, help me. She pressed the phone to her ear, waiting for the response that would change everything. The seconds felt like hours. Then, a voice came through the line, calm but filled with authority. This is Forge, the man said. What do you need, kid? They took Jamal. Please, they're coming for me too. She choked out, tears streaming down her face. She could hear the sound of a motorcycle in the background, the rumble of an engine starting up. Stay hidden, Forge's voice was steady. I'm coming. The phone call ended, and Forge stood motionless in the garage, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like the heat of the Arizona desert. He stared at the phone for a long moment, the words of the little girl echoing in his mind. They took Jamal. Please, they're coming for me too. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable, and Forge's instincts kicked in. He couldn't waste another second. Without a word, he turned and grabbed his leather jacket from the hook, the Thunderwolves patch gleaming under the dim light. As his fingers slid into the sleeves, he called out to his club, the family he had fought beside for years. This is it. Pack up. We leave now. The garage door creaked open, and within moments, the sound of engines roaring to life filled the night air. The Thunderwolves were moving out, and nothing would stop them. As they rolled out of the garage, Forge felt the familiar rhythm of the ride. The bikes hummed beneath them, their engines thundering like distant storms. He glanced at the group riding beside him, men and women he considered. Family. Storm, the towering mechanic with a heart of gold. Phantom, a high school teacher who'd been through more battles than anyone should. Crow, the grandmother who'd ridden across the country twice and had seen the world in ways most people never would. Together, they were more than just a club. They were a brotherhood, bound by loyalty and a deep sense of duty. They didn't need to speak. The looks they exchanged said it all. They were in this together. The road stretched ahead of them, endless and dark, but Forge knew they had a long ride ahead, 420 miles to be exact. It was a trip that could take a normal man most of the day, but the Thunderwolves weren't normal. They pushed forward, speeding down the highways, leaving the city lights behind them. The wind rushed through their hair and jackets, the desert landscape shifting as they made their way north. Forge's mind kept returning to the little girl, Maya. He remembered her at Tyrone's funeral, her small hand gripping his, eyes wide with innocence. Her father had saved his life in Afghanistan, taking a bullet meant for Forge. Now it was Forge's turn to keep a promise. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the miles ticking by slowly, but Forge's focus never wavered. They didn't stop for anything, no food, no gas. The only thing that mattered was getting to that hospital and making sure Maya was safe. The group stayed in formation, a wall of leather and steel, as they raced through the night. It was in the early morning when they crossed the state line into Nebraska, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the desert. Forge's stomach growled, but he ignored it. They would stop when they had to, but not until Maya was safe. The closer they got to the hospital, the heavier the air became. The sound of the bikes was deafening, but Forge could hear his heart beating in time with the rumble of the engines. His mind raced through every possibility. What if the stepfather had already taken her? What if they were too late? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to think like that. Stay sharp, he radioed to the group. We don't know what we're walking into. As they neared the outskirts of the town, they saw the first sign of the hospital in the distance, a lone building standing against the horizon. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows over the empty streets. We're here, Forge said, his voice steady but filled with purpose. The group slowed as they approached the parking lot of Mercy General Hospital. It was eerily quiet, with only a few cars parked outside. Forge scanned the area, eyes narrowing as he looked for any sign of trouble. Something's not right, he muttered to himself. But before he could make sense of it, the doors to the hospital slid open, and Forge's heart skipped a beat. Standing there, in front of the entrance, was a man he knew all too well, Officer Donovan, Maya's stepfather. The same man who had brought her to the hospital, claiming she had fallen. Forge's blood ran cold. He had never trusted Donovan. There was something about him, something off, something that didn't sit right with Forge. Keep your distance, Forge ordered, his voice low but commanding. We wait. The group dismounted, the sound of boots hitting the pavement echoing through the parking lot. They formed a tight circle around Forge, their eyes locked on the door, waiting for the moment to act. Forge took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his leather gloves. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Was Maya inside? Was she safe? Or was this some twisted trap set by Donovan to lure them in? But Forge didn't have time to answer those questions. He had made a promise to Tyrone, and he wasn't about to break it now. The doors to the hospital opened again, and this time, it wasn't Donovan who stepped through. It was a young social worker, her face drawn with exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Mr. Harland? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Maya's waiting for you. But there's something you need to know. The young social worker's eyes were filled with concern as she stepped forward, glancing over her shoulder before looking back at Forge. Mr. Harland, she said, her voice soft but urgent. There's something you need to know. Maya's been through a lot. Forge's heart sank, the weight of her words already filling him with dread. He had prepared for the worst, but hearing it from someone else made it all too real. He clenched his fists, the leather of his gloves creaking under the pressure. Where is she? He asked, his voice steady despite the rising storm inside. The social worker hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts before continuing. She's in room 412. But she's not the same little girl you remember. Forge nodded, his jaw tightening as he began to walk toward the elevator. The other bikers fell in behind him, their presence a silent testament to the loyalty they had for each other and the promise Forge had made to a fallen friend. As the elevator doors slid open, the smell of antiseptic hit him like a wall. The sterile environment of the hospital felt cold and foreign, but Forge didn't let it shake him. The moment the doors opened on the 4th floor, Forge's eyes immediately went to the room number at the far end of the hall. Room 412. He started toward it, his steps deliberate and heavy, as if the weight of every mile he had ridden was pushing him forward. As he reached the door, his hand hovered over the handle for a brief moment before he pushed it open. The sight that greeted him was one that no man should ever have to witness. Maya lay on the bed, her body small and fragile beneath the thin hospital sheets. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, staring at the ceiling, but Forge could see the faint tremor in her hand as it clutched the edge of the blanket. She looked like a child who had been lost in the world, forgotten by everyone but the man who had promised to protect her. Forge's heart ached as he stepped closer. "Maya," he said gently, his voice low and soothing. She didn't respond at first, her eyes still fixed on the ceiling. But as he took another step forward, she turned her head, her gaze finally meeting his. The moment their eyes locked, it was as if a floodgate had opened. She reached out a trembling hand toward him, her lips parting as she whispered, "Uncle Forge." The sound of her voice was like a knife to his heart. She remembered him. She remembered the promise he had made to her father. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I'm here, Maya. I promised. I'd be here," he said softly, his voice rough with the weight of his emotions. The other bikers had entered the room quietly, standing in the background, their eyes never leaving Maya. They understood the gravity of the situation. They knew what this meant. Maya's eyes darted toward them, and for the first time, she smiled. It was a weak, fragile smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. Forge sat down beside her, his large frame filling the small chair next to her bed. He took her hand in his, careful not to hurt her, and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "You're safe now, Maya. You don't have to worry anymore." But Maya's expression faltered. She looked down at her hand in his, then back up at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "They want to take me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My stepdad, he wants to take me away." Forge's grip on her hand tightened. "No one is taking you anywhere, Maya. Not as long as I'm here." He looked over his shoulder at the group of bikers standing by the door, their faces grim but determined. Storm, Crow, Phantom, and the others. All of them were ready to do whatever it took to keep Maya safe. Forge stood up, moving to the window to look out over the parking lot. His mind was racing, processing the information Maya had just given him. The stepfather, Officer Donovan, had been manipulating the situation from the start. Forge had suspected it, but now he knew for sure. Donovan wasn't just a concerned parent. He was a man with a plan, and that plan involved taking Maya back under his control. Forge's blood ran cold as he thought about the implications. Donovan had the law on his side, and without hard evidence of abuse, it would be difficult to fight him in court. But Forge wasn't the kind of man who played by the rules when it came to protecting his family. He was prepared to do whatever it took to make sure that little girl was safe. He turned back to face Maya, his expression hardening. "We're not letting him take you. No one is going to hurt you again." The door opened, and Elena Vargas, the social worker, stepped into the room. Her face was drawn, her eyes tired from the long hours she had spent with Maya. But when she saw Forge's determined look, she knew he wasn't backing down. "I'll do everything I can to help you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But we need to move quickly. The court order could come through any time." Forge nodded, his mind already working on a plan. He knew that time was running out. "We won't let that happen," he said firmly. "Maya's not going anywhere." Forge stood by the window, his mind racing. The silence in the room felt heavy, but it was broken by the sound of footsteps approaching. Elena, the social worker, entered with a stack of papers in her hands, her face drawn with exhaustion. "The court order could come through any minute," she said quietly, her voice tinged with concern. Forge turned to face her, his jaw tight. "We won't let that happen," he replied, his voice steady but filled with determination. Elena paused, glancing at Maya who lay quietly on the bed, still clutching Forge's hand. "I've been talking to the hospital's legal team," she continued. "But they're worried. Without concrete proof, we can't keep her here for long. Donovan has legal custody." Forge's fists clenched, the anger bubbling up inside him. Officer Donovan, Maya's stepfather, was a man of power, a man who had always known how to manipulate the system. But Forge wasn't about to let the law turn its back on a child in need. He walked over to Maya's bedside and knelt down in front of her. "Maya, listen to me," he said gently. "I'm not leaving here without you. You're going to be safe. I promised your father, and I'm going to keep that promise." Maya's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time since the chaos began, a flicker of hope shone in her eyes. She nodded slowly, squeezing his hand. I trust you, Uncle Forge, she whispered. Forge stood up, his resolve hardening. We need to move fast, he said, turning to the group of bikers who had been standing in the corner, waiting. Storm, Phantom, Crow, and the others stepped forward, their faces grim but ready. What's the plan? Storm asked, his deep voice filled with the kind of authority that came from years of loyalty to the club. Forge glanced at Elena, his mind working quickly. We need to keep Maya here until we can figure out a way to get her out of the hospital safely. We need to get a lawyer on our side. Someone who can work fast and knows how to deal with these kinds of situations. Elena nodded, reaching for her phone. I'll get on it, she said. I know someone who might be able to help. But we need to keep Donovan away from her until then. Forge turned to the bikers. We need to make sure no one gets close to this hospital. No one gets Maya. She's not leaving here with him. Understood, Phantom said, his voice steady. We'll make sure of it. Forge's heart pounded as he paced the room. They had no time to waste. He knew Donovan would be coming, and he knew the man wouldn't give up easily. But he also knew that the Thunderwolves didn't back down, no matter the odds. Let's make sure no one gets past us, Forge said firmly, his eyes hardening. He turned back to Maya, who was watching him with wide eyes. Maya, I need you to stay in this room. Don't leave until I get back. Can you do that for me? Maya nodded again, her face still pale but determined. I'll stay, she whispered. Forge gave her a reassuring smile before turning to the others. We're not leaving her alone. We stay together, and we make sure Maya is protected. The bikers nodded, their expressions serious. They knew what needed to be done. They were ready. As Forge led the group out of the room, his thoughts shifted back to Donovan. He had to be stopped. The man was too dangerous, too manipulative. Forge didn't trust him. He had seen men like him before, men who used their power to control and hurt those who couldn't fight back. And Forge had made a promise to a dying friend that he would protect Maya no matter what. The Thunderwolves rode for moments like these, the moments when loyalty and family meant everything. As the bikers took their positions outside, Forge's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, hoping for good news. It was a text message from one of his contacts. I've got some information on Donovan, the text read. He's more connected than we thought. But there's a weakness. It's just a matter of finding it. Forge's heart raced. This was the break they needed. He quickly typed back, keep me posted. He turned to Storm and Phantom. We've got a lead. We need to find Donovan's weakness and use it against him. We're on it, Storm said with a determined nod. We won't let him get away with this. Forge took a deep breath, his mind still racing. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But with the Thunderwolves at his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. And Maya would be safe. He wouldn't stop until she was. The sound of motorcycles filled the air once more, a steady rumble that seemed to echo Forge's resolve. They would protect Maya, no matter the cost. The sound of the motorcycles roaring outside the hospital parking lot was a steady reminder of the promise Forge had made. The Thunderwolves were ready. Forge stood at the window, his eyes scanning the area below. The streets were calm, but he knew that wouldn't last long. Donovan would be coming for Maya, and Forge wasn't going to let that happen. He turned to the group of bikers who had gathered in the hallway, their faces a mixture of determination and concern. We hold our ground, Forge said, his voice steady but filled with an unshakable resolve. We don't let anyone take her. Storm, the massive biker with a soft spot for kids, nodded. We're not backing down, Forge. You know that. Forge's eyes flickered to Maya, who was still in her room, waiting for him to return. He hadn't seen her this scared in a long time. The trauma she had experienced was written all over her face. It tore at Forge's heart, but he couldn't let his emotions get in the way. Maya needed him to be strong, and he couldn't afford to falter now. He walked toward the door, glancing over his shoulder. Stay vigilant, he instructed, his voice firm. We don't know when Donovan will show up, but when he does, we'll be ready. As the bikers nodded in agreement, Forge stepped out into the hallway, his boots echoing on the cold tile floor. He made his way to the elevator, his mind racing. Donovan would be here soon, and Forge knew it wouldn't just be a simple confrontation. Donovan was a cop. He had resources, allies, and connections. He wouldn't give up Maya easily. But Forge had something Donovan didn't, loyalty. The Thunderwolves were family, and they would fight for each other no matter the cost. As Forge reached the elevator, he glanced at his phone. Another message from his contact about Donovan. This time, There was a lead, a weakness in Donovan's history. Forge's heart skipped a beat. This was the break they needed. He quickly typed a response. Send me everything you have. We'll use it. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Forge stepped inside. He felt the familiar weight of his leather jacket, the Thunderwolves patch pressed against his back. It was more than just a symbol. It was a reminder of the promise he had made to Tyrone, to Maya's father. He had sworn to protect his daughter, and nothing would stop him from keeping that vow. The elevator doors opened on the first floor, and Forge stepped out, meeting the eyes of the security guard at the desk. The man gave him a brief nod, but Forge could see the tension in his eyes. Everyone knew something was coming. Forge walked with purpose toward the front doors of the hospital. He didn't know if Donovan was already inside or if he was waiting outside, but he wasn't about to take any chances. As he stepped out into the early morning light, the sounds of the city filled the air, but his focus remained on the hospital entrance. He knew Donovan would do whatever it took to get Maya, and Forge wasn't about to let that happen. The first few minutes were quiet, the calm before the storm. Then, as Forge paced back and forth, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from one of the bikers. Donovan's here. We've got eyes on him. Forge's stomach dropped. He turned to the bikers standing watch. He's here, Forge said, his voice low but filled with urgency. Get ready. As the bikers prepared to move, Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Donovan wouldn't stop until he had Maya. But Forge wasn't going to let that happen. He would make sure of it. As Forge moved toward the entrance, he could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. He tensed, ready for whatever came next. The doors to the hospital slid open, and there, standing in front of him, was Officer Donovan. The man's cold, calculating eyes met Forge's gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. But Forge knew exactly what was happening. Donovan was here to take Maya, and Forge wasn't going to let that happen. Donovan's voice broke the silence. You think you can just walk in here and take her? He sneered, his words laced with contempt. She's mine. Forge's jaw clenched. No, she's not, he said, his voice steady but filled with anger. She's not going anywhere with you. Donovan stepped forward, his hand resting on the sidearm at his waist. You don't want to do this, he warned, his voice dripping with arrogance. I'll have you arrested. Forge took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Donovan's. You're not taking her. Not while I'm breathing. Donovan's lip curled into a sneer, but before he could respond, the sound of motorcycles filled the air. The Thunderwolves had arrived. The roar of the engines was deafening, and Forge could see the bikes lining up in formation, blocking the entrance to the hospital. It was a show of force, and Donovan could see that he was outnumbered. The bikers were ready for whatever came next. Donovan hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the group of bikers surrounding him. He knew this wasn't just a group of ordinary men. They were a family, bound by loyalty and honor. And Forge was their leader. Donovan didn't have the authority to take on a group like this. Forge stepped forward again, his eyes never leaving Donovan's. You don't belong here, Donovan, he said, his voice calm but firm. You're not welcome. Donovan took a deep breath, his hand twitching near his gun. But after a long moment, he stepped back. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low and threatening. I'll be back for her. Forge didn't flinch. We'll be ready. As Donovan turned and walked away, Forge felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had won this round. But he knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Thunderwolves would stay vigilant. They would protect Maya, and they would make sure she was safe, no matter what it took. The following days felt like an endless game of cat and mouse. Forge knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Donovan had backed off for now, but Forge could feel the tension in the air. The Thunderwolves were more than ready to stand their ground, but the real battle was only just beginning. Maya was still in the hospital, but every second she stayed there, it felt like a ticking clock. Donovan was persistent, and Forge knew he would try something else soon. Forge spent the next few days making sure Maya was safe, but there was always that nagging feeling in the back of his mind. What if Donovan found another way to take her? Maya's condition had improved slightly, but she still seemed lost in the nightmare of it all. She hadn't spoken much since Forge's arrival, though her eyes would occasionally meet his with a faint flicker of recognition and trust. It broke Forge's heart to see her like this, but he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. He needed to stay focused. They couldn't afford to lose sight of the bigger picture. The The Thunderwolves kept watch around the hospital at all hours, ensuring that no one got close to Maya. Their presence was like a silent force field, warding off anyone who might have had the wrong intentions. The bikers, with their leather jackets and intimidating demeanor, were impossible to ignore. But as the days passed, the hospital began to feel like a prison. Forge couldn't help but feel the walls closing in. He knew that Maya wasn't safe here forever. There had to be a way out. "We need to get her out of here," Forge said one night as he gathered with his crew in the hospital parking lot. The dim streetlights cast long shadows over the bikes, their chrome gleaming in the moonlight. The air was thick with the tension of a plan in the making. "What do you suggest?" Storm asked, his arms crossed as he looked to Forge for guidance. "We can't stay here forever," Forge replied, his voice low but urgent. "Donovan's not going to stop, and we can't risk Maya being caught in the middle." "We've been through worse," Phantom chimed in. "We'll get her out. We just need a solid plan." Forge nodded. "I know, but we have to be careful. We can't let Donovan or anyone else know what we're doing." "I've got contacts," Crow said, stepping forward. "I know people who can help us move her, but it'll take some time to arrange everything." "Time is something we don't have," Forge said, his mind racing. He glanced back at the hospital. "We can't let Donovan get the upper hand. We need to act before he does." Just then, Forge's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, his eyes scanning the message quickly. It was from his inside contact. "Donovan's making a move," the text read. "He's filing for emergency custody tomorrow." Forge's heart skipped a beat. He immediately turned to the group, his expression darkening. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "We need to get her out of here before then. We don't have a choice." The bikers all nodded in agreement. There was no backing down now. They were going to protect Maya, no matter what it took. The plan was simple. They would sneak Maya out of the hospital under the cover of night and take her to a safe house until they could figure out what to do next. But it wasn't going to be easy. The hospital had security, and they couldn't afford to be seen. But the Thunderwolves were no strangers to secrecy. They had pulled off harder jobs before. Now it was time to put their skills to use for something far more important. Forge's mind was already running through the details. He needed to move quickly. He needed to be strategic. They would have to use their bikes to create a distraction, something that would draw attention away from the hospital's entrance. The bikers would be ready, standing watch to make sure no one saw them. Crow, Phantom, and Storm would get Maya out of the building, while the rest of the crew kept guard. As the night wore on, Forge couldn't help but feel the weight of his promise to Tyrone. He had promised to protect Maya, and he wasn't about to break that promise now. The time had come. They were ready. The plan was set. And Forge knew that when it came to keeping a promise to family, there was no such thing as a second chance. The Thunderwolves would move as one, and they would make sure Maya was safe, no matter what it took. The night was thick with tension as the Thunderwolves prepared to move. Every biker knew that this was the most important mission they'd ever faced. Forge stood in the shadows of the parking lot, eyes scanning the hospital entrance from a distance. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. There was no room for mistakes. They couldn't afford to let Maya fall into Donovan's hands. The plan was set. Crow, Phantom, and Storm were already in position inside the hospital, ready to escort Maya out the back door. The rest of the crew was spread out, covering the perimeter. Forge knew it would be a race against time. They had to move fast. He turned to the bikers standing nearby, their faces grim and focused. "We stick to the plan," Forge said, his voice low but commanding. "We don't deviate. Keep the distractions going until they're out. No one gets through." The bikers nodded, their hands tightening around the grips of their bikes, the sound of engines revving in anticipation. It was almost time. The hospital, once a place of healing, now felt like a battleground. Forge's mind raced, remembering the last time he had seen Maya's father. Tyrone had saved his life, taking a bullet meant for Forge during their time in Afghanistan. He had promised Tyrone he would protect Maya, and Forge would keep that promise, no matter the cost. A quick glance at his watch told him it was time. He gave the signal, and the group sprang into action. The sound of roaring engines filled the air, a thunderous cacophony that reverberated off the walls of the hospital. It was their cover, while the bikers revved their engines, creating a chaotic distraction outside. Crow, Phantom, and Storm made their move inside. They approached Maya's room quietly, their footsteps almost inaudible on the hospital's cold linoleum floors. As they reached the door, Crow nodded to Phantom, who gently turned the handle. The door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside. Maya was still lying in bed, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. But as soon as she saw Crow, a flicker of recognition passed over her face. "We're getting you out of here," Crow said softly, crouching beside the bed. "You're going to be okay." Maya nodded, her eyes filling with tears, but there was a sense of relief in her gaze. Storm moved to the window, keeping watch, while Phantom gently lifted Maya from the bed, cradling her in his arms as if she were his own daughter. They moved swiftly but cautiously, making sure no one saw them as they exited the room. Forge's voice came through their earpieces, steady and reassuring. "You're almost there. Just keep moving." Crow and Phantom moved through the hallway, their steps light but purposeful. As they reached the back door, the sound of a car pulling into the parking lot made them freeze. Maya's grip tightened on Phantom's jacket, and Crow's heart skipped a beat. It was Donovan's car. He was here. They had seconds to get out. Forge's voice crackled in their earpieces. "Move now." Crow pushed open the back door, leading Phantom and Maya outside into the cool night air. The bikes were lined up, engines still revving, ready for their escape. But as they rounded the corner of the hospital, they saw Donovan standing by the main entrance, his eyes scanning the area. He hadn't seen them yet, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Storm's voice came through their earpieces. "He's not alone. There's another car pulling up." Panic surged through Forge, but he pushed it aside. "We have one shot at this," he said, his voice calm. "Get her to the bikes. We're riding out now." Crow and Phantom didn't hesitate. They moved quickly, Maya between them, and ran toward the motorcycles. The engines roared to life, the sound drowning out the chaos of the outside world. Maya clutched Phantom's back as they sped through the hospital parking lot, their tires screeching as they raced toward freedom. Donovan saw them. His eyes narrowed as he ran toward his car, shouting orders into his radio. But it was too late. The Thunderwolves had already made their move. Forge led the pack, the roar of his motorcycle reverberating through the empty streets as they took off into the night. The wind whipped past them, but Forge's focus never wavered. His eyes stayed on the road ahead, on the escape that was now their only priority. They weren't just escaping for Maya's safety. They were riding for something bigger: loyalty, justice, and the promise Forge had made to a fallen friend. As they sped down the highway, the city lights fading behind them, Forge could feel the weight of the journey ahead. They weren't safe yet. Donovan would come after them, but the Thunderwolves weren't afraid. They would fight, they would protect, and they would keep Maya safe. Forge's grip tightened on the handlebars as he pushed his bike faster, the others falling into formation behind him. The storm of chaos was far from over, but for now, they had won a small victory. They were out, and Maya was safe, for now. The road stretched out before them, endless and dark, as the Thunderwolves sped through the night. Forge kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, the engine of his motorcycle roaring beneath him as the wind whipped through his hair. The rest of the crew followed close behind, their bikes in perfect formation, each rider focused on the mission. Maya was safe, for now. But Forge knew that this was only the beginning. They had escaped the hospital, but Donovan was not a man who would give up easily. Forge could feel the weight of the promise he had made to Tyrone, and it was a burden he would carry for as long as it took to protect Maya. He glanced over his shoulder at the riders behind him. Storm, Phantom, Crow, and the others were keeping pace, their faces a mix of determination and quiet resolve. They knew what they were fighting for. They weren't just fighting to protect Maya. They were fighting for family, for loyalty, for the bond that connected them all. "We're heading to the safe house," Forge said over the radio, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "We can't stop until we're there." The response came quickly, the voices of the bikers cutting through the static. "Got it, boss. No stopping." "Understood." Forge didn't need to say more. They all knew what was at stake. The bikes sped through the streets, the city lights fading into the distance as they left the urban sprawl behind. Forge's mind kept replaying the events of the night, the way they had gotten Maya out of the hospital, the way Donovan had nearly caught them. But they had made it. They had escaped. The safe house was their next stop, a place where they could regroup, plan, and keep Maya out of Donovan's reach. But Forge knew it wouldn't be long before Donovan came looking for her. He had too much power, too many connections. The bikers would have to stay one step ahead, ready for whatever came next. As they rode, the landscape around them began to change. The city gave way to the wide open spaces of the countryside. The wind felt cooler here, the air fresher. It was a brief respite from the chaos they had just escaped, but Forge didn't allow himself to relax. The safe house was still miles away, and anything could happen before they reached it. "We're getting close," Storm's voice crackled over the radio. "Stay sharp." Forge gave a nod, though no one could see him. His grip on the handlebars tightened, his knuckles white. They were so close. But as they approached the outskirts of town, Forge's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, hoping for good news. But when he saw the message, his heart sank. "They know where we are," it read. "Donovan's making moves. He's not backing down." Forge cursed under his breath. It was exactly what he had feared. Donovan wasn't going to let them get away. They had to get to the safe house now. The bikers picked up the pace, their bikes thundering down the highway as they pushed forward, the safe house within reach. But as they neared a familiar turn, Forge saw something that made his heart skip a beat. A black SUV was parked on the side of the road, just off the highway. The windows were tinted, but Forge knew exactly what it was. "We've got company," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "Don't stop. Keep riding." The bikers accelerated, but as they passed the SUV, Forge saw two men step out from the shadows, their eyes scanning the road. They had been waiting for them. Forge's heart pounded, but he kept his focus. They couldn't stop. Not now. They were so close. "Everyone stay tight," Forge said into the radio. "We don't let them split us up. Get to the safe house, now." The sound of the bikes roaring down the road grew louder as they picked up speed. The men in the SUV started their engine and pulled onto the road behind them. Forge glanced back, the headlights of the SUV glaring in his rearview mirror. It was a chase now, and he wasn't about to lose. He pushed the bike harder, the engine screaming beneath him as the speedometer climbed. The others followed suit, their bikes matching his pace. The SUV was gaining, but Forge knew the terrain ahead. He knew the turns, the hills, the places where they could outrun the vehicle behind them. As they neared the final stretch, Forge made a sharp turn, taking them off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path that led into the woods. The SUV was forced to slow down, but the bikers had no such problem. They sped through the path, the trees blurring as they cut through the darkness. The sound of the SUV's engine faded behind them, and Forge allowed himself a brief moment of relief. But only a brief one. "We're almost there," he said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "Keep pushing." The safe house was just ahead, hidden in the trees, the lights dim but welcoming. Forge could see it now, the familiar structure rising up ahead. The bikers had made it. They had outrun Donovan, for now. But as they reached the gates, Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they were just one step ahead of disaster. He glanced back one last time, but there was no sign of the SUV. For a moment, it seemed like they were safe. But deep down, Forge knew this was far from over. Donovan would come for them again. And next time, they might not be so lucky. The safe house was quiet, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees outside. Forge stood by the window, his eyes scanning the darkness, his mind still on the chase they had just outrun. It had been close, too close. The relief of reaching the safe house was only temporary. He knew Donovan would come after them again, and this time, it wouldn't be as easy to escape. He turned back to the room, where the rest of the Thunder Wolves were gathered. Storm, Phantom, Crow, and the others sat silently, their faces grim but resolute. Maya was resting in the other room, safe for the moment, but Forge could tell she was still shaken. She had been through too much, and he could see the fear in her eyes every time she looked around. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let any of them down. "We need to prepare," Forge said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. The bikers looked up, all of them waiting for the next move. "Donovan won't stop. He'll find a way to track us down." Storm leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "What's the plan, boss?" Forge's mind was racing. They had to be smart. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a solid plan, one that would keep Maya safe and deal with Donovan once and for all. "We're not running anymore," Forge said firmly. "We stand our ground." The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. The bikers were used to fighting, used to taking on any challenge. But this was different. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for a child who had already been through too much. "We'll make sure he knows we're not backing down," Phantom said, his voice steady and calm. "We've got the numbers. We can take him." Forge nodded. "Exactly. But we need to hit him where it hurts. We need to expose him for what he really is." Crow spoke up next. "You think we can take him down with the law on his side?" Forge looked at her, his eyes hardening. "We don't need the law. We'll make sure the truth comes out." The bikers exchanged looks, their expressions turning serious. They knew the stakes were high, and they knew the risks. But they also knew that nothing was more important than protecting each other. Forge turned back to the window, his mind working through the details. He had to be careful. Donovan was dangerous, and the man had connections that ran deep. But Forge had something Donovan didn't: loyalty. The Thunderwolves were a family, and they would stand together no matter what. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Storm standing behind him. "We've got your back, Forge," Storm said quietly. "Whatever it takes, we'll be there." Forge nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't in this alone. "We need to get the information we need," Forge said, turning back to face the group. "We'll track Donovan, find his weaknesses. He's not untouchable." "And if he comes for us again?" Phantom asked, his voice low. Forge's expression hardened. "Then we make sure he regrets it." The room fell silent for a moment, everyone processing the weight of Forge's words. They were ready for what came next. They were ready to fight. Forge turned and walked toward the door. "Stay sharp. We move out at first light." As he stepped outside, the cold night air hit him, but he didn't feel the chill. He felt a fire inside him, a fire that wouldn't go out. Until Maya was safe. He walked to his bike, his mind focused on the task at hand. The Thunderwolves had always fought for each other, and this time, they would fight to protect a little girl who had no one left to turn to. Forge started his bike, the engine roaring to life. The others followed suit, the sound of their bikes filling the night as they rode out of the safe house and into the unknown. They had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was certain: they weren't backing down. Donovan had underestimated them, and he would pay the price. The road stretched out before them, endless and dark, but Forge felt more determined than ever. They would find a way to stop Donovan, and they would make sure he never came near Maya again. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, orange glow over the horizon. Forge had been up for hours, his mind restless. The Thunderwolves were already preparing, ready to take on whatever came next. Forge stood outside the safe house, staring out into the distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that Donovan was getting closer, that the walls were closing in. Every moment of peace felt like a fragile illusion. The rest of the bikers were gathering around their bikes, making sure everything was ready for the ride ahead. Storm, Phantom, Crow, and the others were all focused, their eyes sharp. They knew what was at stake. The ride to Donovan's hideout would be a critical part of their plan. Forge turned to face his crew. "We move now," he said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "We can't waste any more time." The bikers nodded in unison, each one of them understanding the weight of the mission. They had already been through so much together, but this was different. This was about family. They revved their engines and set off, their motorcycles roaring to life, cutting through the morning air. The road ahead was long, but Forge didn't hesitate. His mind was fixed on one thing: stopping Donovan before it was too late. As they rode through the empty streets, Forge's mind raced. He kept replaying the last few days in his head, the close calls, the constant sense of danger. But every time he thought about Maya, it drove him forward. She was counting on them. She had already lost too much, and he wouldn't let her lose any more. The Thunderwolves followed Forge's lead, their bikes cutting through the open road, their eyes scanning every corner, every potential threat. Forge glanced over at Storm, who was riding beside him. Storm had been with him through thick and thin, and Forge knew that the big man had his back no matter what. "We've got to make sure Donovan never gets his hands on her again," Forge said, his voice steady. "He's too dangerous." "He won't get past us," Storm replied, his voice a low rumble. "We're not letting him hurt anyone else." The group sped on, the wind whipping past them, the sound of their engines filling the air. The road was long, but they knew the destination. Donovan's hideout was in the middle of nowhere, a place where he thought he could hide from the law. But Forge wasn't about to let him get away with it. As they neared the hideout, Forge's grip on his handlebars tightened. He had no idea what they would find there, but he knew they had to be ready for anything. They pulled up to a small, run-down building on the outskirts of town. The windows were boarded up, the place looked abandoned, but Forge could feel the tension in the air. Donovan was here, and Forge wasn't going to let him slip away again. The bikers spread out, taking cover behind the building, their eyes trained on the entrance. Forge signaled for them to move in, his heart pounding in his chest. They made their way to the back of the building, careful not to make a sound. Forge's mind was sharp, focused. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. As they reached the door, Forge motioned for Phantom to take the lead. Phantom, ever the silent operator, crept forward and gently pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, the air thick with dust and stale air. They could hear the faint sound of voices coming from the other side of the room. Donovan was here, but he wasn't alone. Forge signaled for the bikers to move in, and they quickly surrounded the room, their eyes scanning for any signs of danger. Forge's heart raced as they closed in on Donovan. He had no idea what to expect, but one thing was certain: they weren't leaving until Donovan was brought to justice. As they moved deeper into the building, Forge's instincts screamed at him. He could feel something was off, like they were being led into a trap. The voices grew louder, and Forge could hear Donovan's distinct voice. "I knew you'd come," Donovan said, his voice laced with a dangerous calm. Forge's blood ran cold. Donovan had been expecting them. "You're not going to win this, Forge," Donovan continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I've got everything I need to take Maya back, and there's nothing you can do about it." Forge stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're not taking her," he said firmly, his voice low but filled with fury. "Not while I'm standing in your way." Donovan chuckled, his voice echoing through the room. "You think you can stop me? You and your little gang of bikers? You've got no idea what you're up against." But Forge didn't flinch. He knew what he was up against, and he wasn't backing down. "You're going to regret this," Forge said, his voice cold and unwavering. He signaled to the bikers, and they moved forward, surrounding Donovan and his men. It was time to end this. The standoff was tense, the air thick with the weight of the moment. But Forge knew they had the upper hand. Donovan might have the law on his side, but the Thunderwolves had something stronger: loyalty, brotherhood, and a promise that couldn't be broken. With a final nod to his crew, Forge stepped forward, ready to finish what they had started. The tension in the room was palpable. Forge stood at the front, his eyes fixed on Donovan, whose smug expression hadn't wavered despite the situation. The rest of the bikers were positioned around the room, their eyes sharp, every movement calculated. They knew that the moment Forge made the first move, everything would shift. Donovan, still standing defiantly, slowly raised his hands in mock surrender. "You really think you can take me down?" he sneered, his eyes darting from Forge to the rest of the bikers. "You're just a bunch of outlaws. What do you think you can do against the law?" Forge took a step forward, his boots echoing on the dusty floor. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. He knew this wasn't just about saving Maya anymore. It was about sending a message. "The law," Forge said, his voice cold and steady. "The law has failed her. The law turned its back on Maya. But we won't." Donovan smirked, clearly underestimating the resolve of the group. "You think you can protect her from me?" he taunted, his hand twitching towards the gun holstered at his side. But Forge wasn't afraid. He wasn't going to give Donovan the chance to make a move. "You're not going anywhere," Forge said firmly. He turned his head slightly, signaling to his crew. Storm stepped forward, his massive form blocking any possible escape. Phantom, Crow, and the rest of the bikers moved to secure the exits. There was no way out for Donovan now. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the silence between words growing heavier by the second. Donovan, realizing the noose was tightening, dropped the facade of arrogance. His eyes narrowed, and Forge could see the calculation in his gaze. "You'll regret this," Donovan growled, his voice suddenly lacking the confidence it once had. Forge smiled grimly. "I already have," he replied. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was only minutes. Donovan's eyes flickered between the bikers, his fingers drumming against his side. It was clear he was weighing his options. He could make a move, try to draw his weapon, but Forge and his crew would be on him in an instant. The bikers, all experienced in combat situations, knew how to anticipate every move, how to act faster than anyone could process. Donovan's chance had passed. You've made your move, Forge said, taking a step closer to Donovan. Now it's our turn. The words were barely out of his mouth before Storm, moving like a shadow, had already disarmed Donovan with a swift, practiced motion. The gun fell to the ground with a soft thud. Donovan's face twisted with frustration, but Forge wasn't done. We're not here to fight. We're here to end this. He looked Donovan in the eyes, and for a moment, Donovan seemed to shrink, the weight of the situation finally settling in. This isn't over, Donovan spat, trying to regain his composure, but Forge knew better. Donovan might think this was a setback, but Forge could see the fear in his eyes now. The control, the power he had once held, was slipping away. Forge turned to the rest of the bikers. Get him. Out of here, he ordered. The bikers moved in, grabbing Donovan by the arms, forcing him toward the back of the building. He struggled, trying to break free, but it was no use. He was surrounded. You can't do this, Donovan protested, but Forge wasn't listening. He was already thinking about what came next. Maya's safety was paramount. The longer they kept Donovan here, the more dangerous the situation became. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Storm, get him in the truck, Forge said. Storm nodded and, with one final look at Donovan, shoved him toward the exit. The others followed, making sure the path was clear. Forge stayed behind for a moment, taking in the scene. The air was thick with tension, but the Thunderwolves had done what they came here to do. They had neutralized the threat. Now it was time to move forward. He turned back to the room where Maya had been waiting. She had been so quiet since they arrived, so small in this big world. But now, Forge could see the flicker of hope in her eyes again. She was safe. For now. Forge stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Maya was sitting on the bed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When she saw him, her eyes filled with relief, and she slowly got to her feet. Is it over? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Forge smiled gently, his heart swelling with the promise he had made. It's over, he said. You're safe now. Maya's face softened, and for the first time since they'd met, she allowed herself to smile. Forge knew it would take time for her to heal, but for the first time in a long time, she had hope. They all did. The battle wasn't over, Forge knew that. Donovan wasn't finished yet, and there were still obstacles ahead. But for tonight, at least, they had won. And that was enough. The days that followed were filled with a heavy silence, the kind that lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Forge paced the small room where Maya had been resting, his mind constantly racing with the possibilities of what Donovan might do next. They had neutralized the immediate threat, but Forge knew that Donovan wasn't the type to just give up. He had too much to lose. The promise Forge had made to Tyrone was still weighing on him, and now, more than ever, it felt like a heavy chain around his neck. Maya sat quietly by the window, staring out into the distance, her small frame tense and withdrawn. The peaceful moment was fleeting, but it was the calm they needed before the next battle. Forge walked over and knelt down beside her. You okay? He asked softly, his voice gentle but full of concern. Maya's eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment, she seemed to hesitate before she spoke. I'm okay, she whispered, though Forge could see the uncertainty in her eyes. I'm just tired. Forge nodded, feeling the weight of the situation press in on him. She had every right to be tired. What she had been through was unimaginable, and yet here she was, still fighting. It was a strength Forge had seen in few others, but it was one that ran deep in her. You're safe here, Forge said, his voice firm and reassuring. We'll make sure it stays that way. Maya nodded but didn't say anything. Forge stood up, his thoughts already turning to the next steps. The safe house had to be more than just a temporary refuge. They needed a plan, something that would take down Donovan for good, something that would keep Maya safe without looking over their shoulders every minute of every day. He turned to leave the room but paused at the door, glancing back at her. Stay here, he said, his voice softer this time. We'll figure this out. As Forge stepped outside, he was met by the rest of the Thunderwolves. The air was thick with tension, but there was a sense of unity that couldn't be ignored. Storm, Phantom, Crow, and the others were gathered in the yard, their bikes lined up in formation, ready to move at a moment's notice. Storm looked up as Forge approached, his expression grim. We've been talking, he said. We need to hit Donovan where it hurts. Take out his sources, his influence. Forge nodded. I agree, he said. But we need to be smart about this. Donovan's not stupid. He knows we're coming for him. He'll be prepared. So what's the plan? Phantom asked, his arms crossed. Forge stood silently for a moment, his mind working through the options. We need to get to his network. Forge said finally, his voice low but filled with determination. We start with his contacts, his connections. He's been too careful, but he's got weaknesses, and we need to exploit them. You want to go after his people? Crow asked. That could lead us right to him. Forge met her eyes, his gaze hard. Exactly. We'll hit him hard and fast. We'll make sure he has nowhere to hide. The bikers exchanged glances, their faces set in determination. We've got your back, Storm said, his voice steady. Let's do this. The next few days were spent preparing. The Thunderwolves weren't just a group of bikers. They were a family, and they fought together as one. They gathered information, tracking down Donovan's contacts, finding out who was in his inner circle. It wasn't easy. They had to be careful, quiet, and patient. But Forge knew they had no choice. Donovan was dangerous, and every second they waited, he got closer to finding Maya. The tension grew with each passing day. Maya remained at the safe house, but her anxiety was growing. Every noise made her jump. Every car that passed by seemed like a potential threat. Forge could see it in her eyes. She was scared. And the last thing he wanted was for her to lose that fragile hope she had finally started to regain. Forge's thoughts were interrupted when Storm approached him. We've got something, Storm said, his voice low. We tracked down one of Donovan's contacts. He's got a meeting tonight. Forge's heart raced. Where? We're close, Storm replied. We can take him out tonight. Get the intel we need to finish this. Forge nodded. Let's go. The Thunderwolves revved their engines, their bikes rumbling to life as they prepared to hit the streets once more. It was time to finish this. They were close. Donovan's empire was built on lies, corruption, and manipulation, and the Thunderwolves were about to tear it all down. They rode into the night, the road stretching out before them like a dark, endless tunnel. They had no idea what awaited them at the end, but they weren't afraid. The Thunderwolves were a family, and they would protect each other until the end. As they approached the meeting location, Forge's mind was sharp, focused. They had to move quickly, but they couldn't afford to be sloppy. Donovan's people would be expecting something. They had to strike before they had the chance to react. The building loomed ahead, dark and quiet. Forge's heart pounded as he led the bikers to the entrance, the sound of their engines muffled by the surrounding buildings. This was it. Donovan was close, and Forge was ready to finish this once and for all. The night air was thick with tension as Forge and the Thunderwolves circled the building where Donovan was believed to be hiding. The motorcycles roared in the dark, their engines like thunder rolling across the sky. Forge could feel his pulse quicken as the plan began to unfold. They had no more time to waste. Donovan's empire, built on lies and manipulation, was crumbling. This was it. The final move. They had tracked Donovan's men to this abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was dimly lit, shadowed by the overhanging trees and the forgotten alleyways. Forge's mind was focused. He had one goal, to take Donovan down, end this, and make sure Maya was safe. The rest of the bikers knew their roles. Storm, Phantom, Crow, and the others all positioned themselves strategically around the perimeter, ready to make their move. Forge glanced over at Storm, who gave a subtle nod, signaling that the crew was in place. Forge's eyes turned to the door of the warehouse, his heart pounding with anticipation. They were close. Donovan was here, and Forge wasn't going to let him slip away this time. They needed to act fast. The stakes had never been higher. The doors creaked open as Forge led the charge, his boots pounding the floor. The Thunderwolves surged forward, their faces grim, ready for whatever came next. The silence in the building was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their footsteps echoing through the corridors. They moved swiftly, stealthily, staying out of sight, making sure not to alert anyone inside. As they reached the central area of the warehouse, Forge could see shadows moving in the distance. Donovan's men. They were armed, and they were on high alert. Ready? Forge's voice crackled in the radio. We move on my mark. The bikers tensed, waiting for the signal. Forge's mind was sharp, his every move calculated. The moment they were in position, he gave the order. Go. The Thunderwolves moved in like a well-oiled machine, their bodies in perfect sync. The noise of the engines, the shouts of Donovan's men, the clash of metal, It all happened in an instant. Forge moved fast, cutting through the chaos. His target was Donovan. He could feel the adrenaline surging through him, his heart racing. The warehouse was a maze of stacked crates and metal beams, a perfect hiding place for someone like Donovan. But Forge wasn't letting him hide this time. "Donovan!" Forge shouted, his voice commanding, echoing through the vast, empty space. This instant, there was a pause, a split second where the world seemed to freeze. Then Forge saw him. Donovan stepped out from behind a stack of crates, his face twisted with anger. "You think you've won?" Donovan sneered, his voice full of venom. "You're nothing but a bunch of outlaws." Forge took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Donovan's. "You've been running for too long," he said, his voice calm but fierce. "It's time for you to face the consequences." Donovan's eyes flickered with rage. He pulled a gun from his holster, the cold metal gleaming in the dim light. Forge didn't hesitate. He moved faster than Donovan could react, disarming him in one swift motion. The gun clattered to the floor, and Donovan stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You're done," Forge said, his voice low but filled with certainty. The rest of the bikers swarmed in, surrounding Donovan and his remaining men. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and they knew it. Donovan looked around, realizing he had no escape. "You think this is over?" he spat, his voice desperate. "I have connections. I'll be out in no time." Forge took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Donovan's face. "Not this time," he said. "This time it's over." The Thunderwolves were relentless. They had made sure Donovan couldn't hide anymore, couldn't manipulate his way out of this. It was a long time coming, and now it was finally happening. "Take him in," Forge ordered, turning to the rest of the bikers. They moved in, grabbing Donovan by the arms, and forced him to his knees. He was finally under their control. As Donovan was restrained, Forge took a deep breath. The tension in the room began to lift, the weight of the battle easing. They had done it. They had stopped him. "This is where it ends," Forge said, his voice steady but full of resolve. "You'll never hurt anyone again." As the bikers began to secure Donovan and his men, Forge's thoughts turned back to Maya. She was safe now, and that was the most important thing. The chaos was finally over. Donovan had been stopped, his influence shattered, and the Thunderwolves had kept their promise. Forge knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel a sense of relief. The promise he made to Tyrone was fulfilled. Maya was safe, and the Thunderwolves had proven that loyalty and family were stronger than anything Donovan could throw at them. The sound of the engines outside was a familiar comfort. They were leaving the warehouse, moving forward, but Forge knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. They were a family, bound by loyalty, and nothing could break that bond. The Thunderwolves had won this fight, and they would keep winning, one battle at a time.